All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alison Little, and I'm the Program Manager at the Ontario Historical Society. Welcome to History Educators 2, the second in a series of professional development sessions we've developed for educators in Ontario, and the sixth in our Strengthening Ontario's Heritage Network webinar series. Today's webinar is hosted in partnership with the Ontario History and Social Sciences Teachers Association and will be led by Risa Gluskin and Scott Pollock. So just a bit of information about the OHS and OHASSTA, if you're not already familiar. The Ontario Historical Society is a non-profit corporation and registered charity, a non-government group founded in 1888, bringing together people of all ages, all walks of life, and all cultural backgrounds interested in preserving some aspect of Ontario's history. OHASSTA, the Ontario History and Social Sciences Teachers Association, is a volunteer organization of practicing history and social science teachers in Ontario's elementary and secondary schools. OHASSTA seeks to foster and promote awareness, appreciation, and respect for history and the social sciences as vital components of both school and lifelong learning. I think it's important to state, especially given today's webinar topic, that the OHS and OHASSTA are nonprofit groups and not part of the Ontario Ministry of Education. The guidance, resources, and advice provided today are not the Ministry's guidelines, but are intended to provide professional support as you interpret the new curriculum documents. So our webinar today will start very shortly. I'm just going to do a brief bit of technical support and introduce our speakers, and then we'll head right into Risa and Scott's presentation, and we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions. Just a few things to go over on the technical side. In order to ask a question during this webinar, you just type your question in the space provided below question in the menu bar on your right-hand side. If you can't see the question space, you may need to expand the question section tab by clicking on it, and then you'll see a space with type a question to staff. That's where you write. The questions come directly to me in a private chat, and I'll be collecting all the questions, and if there's a question that comes up that's quite pertinent, needs to be addressed right away, I'll jump in and ask Risa and Scott, but generally I will keep all the questions until the very end for our question session. If you have a comment you want to share with the whole group, please feel free to use the chat window, and everyone can see those comments in the chat window. This webinar is being recorded, just a reminder, and that recording will be made available to members of the OHS on our website and later to the public through our YouTube channel. So we will make today's slides available for download later this week. Don't worry about writing everything down. Now, a bit about our speakers. Risa Gluskin has been teaching at York Mills Collegiate Institute in Toronto for the past 15 years, where she is Assistant Curriculum Leader of Canadian and World Studies. Risa has delivered professional development workshops at OHASSTA and OISE and has conducted demonstration classrooms for the Toronto District School Board. She was a presenter for the Historical Thinking Project. She enjoys sharing her resources that scaffold the research and writing process for students in history and social science. Many of her resources can be found on her blog, so please check it out, gluskin.ca. Our second speaker today is Scott Pollock. Scott has been teaching history and social sciences for 13 years. He's currently a department head at St. Mildred's Lightburn School in Oakville, and Scott is also a PhD candidate at OISE and the University of Toronto, where his research focuses on the concept of historical thinking, the spread of historical thinking within Canada, and history teacher education. All right, so I'm going to just change presenter here and let Risa take it over.
I guess we should just say our plan before we start. We're trying to have 20 minutes on sort of an intro because most people sound like they're somewhat familiar with the concepts, and then 20 minutes on actual examples from implementation, and then, like Alison said, 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Scott, obviously. I just wanted to start off before we get going by thanking everybody for coming out and thanking the OHS for setting this up. I think this is an awesome way to leverage technology and to give us a chance to dialogue with each other. So in terms of the historical thinking concepts themselves, the idea of historical thinking isn't new at all. It's been around for decades, really. This most recent sort of version of it began really in the UK in the 60s, and there's been just a ton of research in the UK, US, Australia, and Canada over the past 40 years. Right now, all of that research, I think, offers a really strong rationale for the teaching of history and the development of historical thinking skills. So to me, I mean, really the benefit of historical thinking is that it seems to have evolved from a desire to elevate the teaching of history and move us away from the regurgitation of facts, which was sort of typical of history teaching in the not too distant past. And I think this offers us the opportunity to teach history in a way that students will find incredibly meaningful and very, very engaging.
So building on that, in order to teach in this new method, oh, by the way, hi everyone, I'm Risa. Sorry about that. In order to teach in this new method, you have to understand certain basic principles of historical thinking, and the most important one is that history is not the same as the past. So I like to represent this with the big rectangle and the small rectangle inside of it, with the red large rectangle being the past and the blue small rectangle being history, because of course the past is everything that ever happened, which of course we cannot know about, whereas history is our interpretation, it's our selection, it's what evidence has been passed down to us. So we say that basically history is constructed, and you can't really teach in a historical thinking mode if you don't understand that. So therefore we have to interpret the evidence that history has left to us, and as we do this, we will leave certain things out, we will tell some stories, and if you look at this poster, which is from the Historical Thinking Project, I love the question, how do we decide what and whose stories to tell? Whose stories are left out? As we know in the past, in history teaching in Ontario, you know, there were a lot of men, there were a lot of kings and queens and prime ministers, but in this view of history, we really, I guess more of a bottom-up view, we can say that there's more stories to tell. So that's one example of that. Now we're going kind of quickly through this section of our introduction to historical thinking because we obviously want to save lots of time for talking about real-life examples. It's really exciting. I mean, I think both Scott and I agree on this. It's so exciting that historical thinking is actually explicitly in the new Ontario curriculum now. So we just wanted to point out a couple of things about this. In the overall expectations, we have the four main historical thinking concepts the Ontario Ministry of Education has chosen to go with: significance, cause and consequence, continuity and change, and historical perspectives. But we also want to draw attention to the inquiry strand, which is the use of primary source evidence, which is the first strand in the grade 10 history document. It's actually called Historical Inquiry and Skill Development, and it's not an afterthought. It is the first strand. It comes before the first chronological unit of the course, so that's very exciting. Ethical dimensions of history, that is a historical thinking concept, at least according to the Historical Thinking Project. The Ontario government has chosen to downplay it a little bit, but if you read the sort of the frontal matter before the actual curriculum expectations, you'll see that ethics, of course, are a part of the study of history. This poster is another from the Historical Thinking Project, and this is probably my favorite of their 6 posters. How do we know what we know? That is basically, if you're going to be working with historical thinking, you want to be working with documents, you want to be working with primary source evidence, and we have to get the kids to ask, how do we know? How do we know it's true? They have to therefore learn the skills of inferring, they have to understand context, they have to recognize speakers and writers' worldviews. Just this little visual kind of takes the 6 historical thinking concepts, and the idea is that they're all there. It takes critical thinking to do all of them, but I kind of think of primary evidence or primary sources as they're explained here as being at the center. You can't totally do historical thinking without putting the actual historical documents at the center and then you can have the kids interpret them. So therefore, my little phrase that I like to use is that these things are not the secret language of history. It kind of used to be that in the past, even if you took history in university, the professors, the teachers, they didn't really talk about this stuff. They just assumed that you could do it. Whereas now our entire purpose of teaching in the historical thinking mode is to teach the students explicitly how to do these things. And of course, if we use personal examples, it can really help the kids understand what we mean by each historical thinking concept. So those are just some of the basic principles to help us understand why we're using historical thinking. So Scott, if you want to go on.
Just to talk a little bit about the research base upon which the historical thinking concepts are built, and it really does build off of the point Risa was just making about making the language of history explicit and really bringing that to the forefront so that students are made aware of it. As I said earlier, interest in historical thinking began in Britain in the 60s, and there have been a huge number of research projects, some of them involving thousands of students conducted over the past 40 years. And while there's still some gaps, obviously there always are with research, there seems to be a growing consensus that we can conceive of students' development of historical thinking as something of a continuum. And different models have been put forth. You can see on the slide sort of a summary of one of them. It's put together by Bruce Van Sledwright, and I think it was sent out to everybody who's participating here today. But basically, Van Sledwright argues that students tend to go through 3 stages as they're developing their conception of what history is. Students tend to start off with the idea, what he refers to as the naive realist idea, that history is just something that happened. It is just ready-made, and the textbook is a perfect description of what has happened. They really have no understanding that there are, historians who are actively engaged in research and writing, and that they're writing from a particular perspective. All of those ideas are foreign to them. So a student who's working at that level, if they were presented with 2 different accounts of the same event, they wouldn't be able to adjudicate between the 2 of them. They would maybe just pick one of them randomly, or they might think that one of them is more recent than the other. As students become a bit more aware about what it means to study history and how history is written, they move into what Van Sledwright calls the borrower phase, naive relativism. And at this point, students have recognized that history is something that's constructed by historians based upon evidence, but they lack the criteria, the concepts by which to analyze the histories that are being put in front of them. Finally, the most sophisticated students, who Van Sledwright calls critical pragmatists, those students have developed this really rich criteria and vocabulary. They understand cause and effect relationships, they understand significance, they understand how primary documents are used so that they're able to look at a history in a sort of critical fashion. This research has shown quite clearly that students do not progress through these phases in a predictable sort of linear fashion. It's also demonstrated quite clearly that a student can be really advanced in one area and not another. So somebody might be really good at engaging in perspective taking, but still struggle with cause and effect relationships or something like that. I think this research is really, really important, or should be important to history teachers, because it highlights how we might go about conceiving of our students developing thinking and how we might assist them. And this is articulated in the Historical Thinking Project by the guideposts, which Risa will tell you about now.
What Scott was talking about, this idea of the criteria list and this non-linear development, can really be aided if you buy this book. I don't work for the publisher. The Big Six is really the guide to how do you actually take a big historical thinking concept, let's say like significance, and how do you break it down into smaller pieces or chunks by which students can learn to actually do history. So the big six is both academic and practical. Each historical thinking concept is given a chapter, and within that, each one has sort of a philosophical or, I guess, a research-based component, and then all kinds of activities. Now, the best thing that the Big Six does is it breaks down the guideposts or the criteria that you can break each historical thinking concept into. Oh, and I just want to mention that these things are not in the Ontario curriculum. So if you want to do historical thinking well and you want to follow the curriculum, in my thinking, you've got to have scaffolds. You've got to have smaller bits and pieces to make it doable. So that's what the guideposts are for. So instead of just saying that classic old teacher question, what is the significance of, you can allow students to develop or apply the criteria of significance. So are consequences of events deep? For how many people? Over how long a time? That's how students can learn to assess whether something is significant or not. I personally hate that question, what is the significance of? It's just too broad. Or, for example, under causes and consequences, we can break that down further. And the one that I've chosen to highlight here, and you'll see it a little bit later in one of our activities, is that there are both intended and unintended consequences of things, with more consequences being unintended than intended. Within continuity and change, you'll see progress and decline. You can teach students to recognize that different groups experience progress and decline. We can also teach them to recognize turning points, and we'll talk more about continuity and change a bit later in one of our examples. Lastly, under historical perspectives, probably one of the most important things is to teach students to avoid presentism, which is the imposition of today's values and beliefs onto the past, when they are making historical assessments. So these things, they're not in the Ontario curriculum, but if you're going to teach your students to think deeply in the mode of historical thinking, these are the tools that can allow you to do that.
And just to add one thing to what Risa was saying about the guideposts, one of the other neat things about them is that they do describe a continuum. So they recognize, for example, with historical significance, students will often quickly pick up on the idea that something can be historically significant because of its scope, because of the number of people it affected, because of its scale. But they tend to struggle with the idea that an event that impacted a smaller group of people can still be very, very significant, and you can make a strong argument for its significance, even though it doesn't have the scale of, say, World War I or World War II. In terms of inquiry, as I'm sure you're all aware, inquiry is right in the front matter of the new curriculum. It is supposed to be sort of central to everything that we're doing. The historical thinking process really melds itself hand in glove with inquiry. It fits just beautifully. Whenever you are attempting to use the historical thinking concepts in a sort of rich fashion, you're able to engage in authentic inquiry with the students and to put exploration very much into their hands. We've, I think, said a lot of this already, but really, by adopting this particular approach, teachers are empowered because they're going to put much more emphasis on inquiry-driven approach to learning. They're going to put more emphasis on how we teach rather than what we teach. And what we'd like to do now in this sort of second section is look at some really sort of concrete examples of that. There are many, many different ways to introduce the historical thinking concepts. I personally like to do them right from the beginning of my course, sort of right out of the box. And so I've developed over the years a number of different activities that are very easy, very student-friendly, fun, but also offer a good opportunity to talk about the concepts and to get a sense of where your students' ability is at in terms of historical thinking. So one is what I call teacher in a box, and the name kind of describes it. I tend to show up on my first day of classes with a large box full of things from my home. I ask the students to sort of sort through these objects, which all have some connection to me, and to make inferences. And I ask them to divide their inferences into different categories: things that they're sure of, things that they think are good guesses, and then things that they think are just wild guesses. In doing this, the students, it's a nice way to introduce myself, of course, and the students begin to develop their concept of what it means to work with evidence. So for example, the idea that when you have multiple sources of evidence that are leading you to the same inference, that's an inference that you're more certain of, is something that they come across. It's also fun, and I encourage anybody who does this activity to do this, include some things that they're very likely to misinterpret. So just as a personal example, my wife is vegetarian, has been for a very long time, so we have a cornucopia of vegetarian cookbooks, so I always throw in a few of those, and the students almost always infer that I must be vegetarian when in fact I'm not. Another fun activity I do on the first day is what I call the historical significance cards. You can see an example just in the upper right-hand corner. I have a series of 30 or 40 cards dealing with major events that are going to be covered in the course. There's usually a couple of images and then a very brief description of the event. I give the students these cards in groups and ask them to go through them and to determine as a group which are the 10 most significant. And this is a lot of fun because it's a great way to preview some of the course content, to get them thinking about it, but it also introduces the idea of historical significance because they need to begin to develop some criteria so that they can decide which of these are significant and which are not. Usually there's a lot of overlap in their choices, and that's something else that you can discuss, why it is that they tend to shy away from certain topics. So there's lots of opportunity there. When it comes to planning things for my units themselves, once I get into the sort of meat of the course, Risa and I think we both tend to adopt a backwards by design approach. So I keep in mind the overall curriculum objectives and as well as some of my own personal goals for the course. So just one example is a project that I developed for the 1950s. And we just have up on the next few slides the overall objectives for that era. I assume that nobody has them memorized. So looking through these different overall objectives and keeping in mind that one of my personal goals is for my students to begin to question some of the narratives that we have about our past, I decided I wanted to do an oral history project when it came time to study the 1950s. So essentially my students are asked to go out and interview people who were teenagers in the 1950s. I'm usually able, through some connections within the community, to actually get students who maybe don't know anybody from that time period, somebody that they can interview, and often they're people who are connected to our school community, which is a kind of neat thing to do as well. What's fun about this activity, we begin by talking about the images that we have of the 1950s. So, the kids bring up, Grease, Leave It to Beaver, Elvis, all of those sorts of things. And then they go off and they do these interviews and come back and share what they found with us. And almost immediately they begin to see that the 1950s is a much more nuanced decade. There were lots of things going on there that aren't necessarily represented in those sort of dominant narratives that we have. So it really pushes them to rethink some of the things that they believe. In comparing how these generalizations fit with their own individual oral histories, it offers the opportunity to have a really awesome discussion around how historians work with evidence, how they corroborate evidence, how they move from particular to making some generalizations about a time period. And it also has the benefit of being just a lot of fun. I mean, the students are usually pretty intimidated when they first start because, I mean, it's really scary to interview somebody if you've never done that before, but once they get going with it, they really sort of enjoy the whole process.
Scott, can I just ask you to go back for 1 second to the slide where you were talking about the historical significance cards and just say something about its diagnostic value?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I mean, actually both activities, the teacher in a box and the historical significance cards are wonderful diagnostic assessments. You really do get a sense right the very first day of your students' historical thinking ability. So just looking at the cards, usually while the students are sort of going through those and sorting and discussing criteria and whatnot, I'm floating around from group to group, just kind of eavesdropping and figuring out what sort of criteria students are using. how they're going about making use of the criteria, how they're trying to apply them, that sort of stuff. It really gives you a chance to watch the kids and sort of figure out who it is that you have in front of you.
So just in terms of whether we're using ministry speak as for and of, or whether we're using the more teacher-friendly language. So the oral history project was an example of a summative or assessment of learning. And the one I'm going to talk about now is also a summative or assessment of learning. So this is an example that comes from the applied history curriculum expectations, and there's a couple of good new textbooks out specifically for the applied history, so obviously people are paying attention to this. I don't want to claim credit for this activity. It's from Jan Haskins-Winter, a teacher in TDSB and president of OHASSTA. So what we want to just preface this with is the idea that inquiry is engaging, so it should be fun and doable for the applied level kids. So this activity asks kids to make some World War II collector cards. You can see the curriculum expectation here, and it does say focus on cause and consequence. So it fits in perfectly with the activity. So I just have a scan here of the overview of the assignment, which is basically for the kids to make their own collector cards related to various events from World War II. Now, to me, that sounds really good for applied learning because it is visual. It gets them to do the analysis without the lengthy write-ups, and it also is not just knowledge.
The one thing I would add, if you can just go back for 1 second, Risa, is you can see in the learning goals, like Jan has done a really interesting thing here with the expectations and then the learning goals and the criteria. So she's very much indicated to her students that their choices need to be varied, right? So she's meeting the curriculum expectations in a really clever way by having the students look at various sorts of various areas within World War II. You know, not allowing them just to focus on the weapons of war or key individuals or something like that. So as she has, in this second scan, you can see that the students are required to have 7 cards. They need to have, a picture on the front and all that sort of stuff that you would expect. Aside from that, she also asked for an original description on the back of the card answering the question of who, what, where, when. So she wants the students to talk about causes, consequences, and significance. So she's tied the historical thinking concepts in there really, really elegantly. She's also included a really nice planning sheet to assist the students and provide them some scaffolding.
And what I like about that is that she has specifically asked them in their scaffolding organizer to identify causes, obviously, but not just consequences, the intended consequences and the unintended. So it's really tying in the guideposts that we were talking about. And obviously you can't just hand a kid an organizer and say, here, figure out the unintended and intended consequences. Obviously that skill has to be taught previously to the students, but it's actually really fun for students to think about unintended consequences of events. And in this sort of hands-on activity where the kids are actually making something, they're doing the full inquiry, they're doing the full critical thinking, they're just not writing it up in a format that we would say is, text heavy. So I really like the activity that she has, and you can even take some of the activities from the Garfield Ginny Newman, the old applied history textbook, and the teacher's guide. It has something similar to this, and you can adapt it to the new curriculum. Everything's pretty adaptable. So that was our applied history example. So we've got academic and applied, and we've got 2 examples of summative assessment, and we heard a diagnostic too. So the one I want to talk about next is something that I did in an ESL history section. So it's the academic curriculum expectations that are accommodated, even I guess you could say modified, for English language learners, some of whom you might have in your classes. So even if you didn't have a specific section of history devoted to newcomers, you could, I guess, give them this as an example of differentiated instruction. So what we have here is a look at continuity and change in Canada's relationship with Quebec. And now I'll be honest, I was running out of time at the end of the course, and I didn't want to end with World War II. I wanted to get a lot farther. So I was looking for something that would give the students a bit of a sweep of Canada, Quebec, or what we call, we used to call French-English relations. And you can see my curriculum expectation there. The curriculum specifically says focus on continuity and change and historical perspectives for this part. So you can assess multiple historical thinking concepts in one assignment. So this is assessment as learning. This is formative assessment. You don't always have to assess things for marks. And I do that all the time in my grade 11 and 12 history courses, where we do activities that develop our historical thinking abilities, but they are not necessarily being marked. So formative assessment, where students monitor their own learning and use the feedback to adjust, adapt, or change what they understand. What I like about this is that we're meeting the guidepost, the first guidepost of continuity and change, which is that they are not opposites, they are intertwined. So just like previously we were talking about, there are unintended and intended consequences of events. Continuity and change, they're not, kids often will see them as opposites. They're not, they're intertwined. So what we have in this activity, it's kind of like a scavenger hunt. So I took a sections of the textbook, and I created this 2-page handout, and I pretty much summarized what the book was saying about different events in French-English relationships, because of course the students have, it takes them a really long time to read, so I wanted to simplify it. The students were told what page, and then they had to figure out the year. If I were doing this over again, I'd put a few blanks in my event write-ups and have them write in a few words there. But what the students had to do was, for each event, they had to look at continuity and or change, and they had to say whether each event was showing continuity in the relationship between French and English people, or I guess we say Quebec and Canada, or whether it was showing change, or both. So the really important thing to do there is to ask the question, how and for the questions, how and for whom. Because when you just say to the kids, okay, identify continuity and change in this event, they just look at you with blank looks. So I've found, well, for whom? Are things the same? Are things different? For whom are things the same? For whom are things different? And then they can start to look at different groups in society. When you talk about how have things changed? How have things remained the same? I really like to get the kids to draw little spectrums, maybe from 1 to 5 or from 1 to 10, and we can assess whether an event is a 1, meaning, oh, it's kind of a small thing, not bringing that much change, or 10, it's a big thing, it's affecting so many people. So what they're actually doing there is they're weaving in significance while they're doing continuity and change. So after they would go through 2 full pages of this, the kids might feel, okay, well, we're done. We filled in our chart. But of course, what I always like to say to my students is that the filling in of the chart is just the process. It's what we do afterwards with that information that is really the most important thing. So I do have the question at the bottom. Overall, what conclusions can you draw about continuity and change in Canada's relationship with Quebec? It's a very wide question. It's a very broad question, and I think students would have trouble with that. In fact, students did have trouble with that. So you can break it down into, you know, for which groups has there been more continuity, for which groups have there been more change, has there been more change. And one thing I was really thinking about is after analyzing the patterns over the last 40, 50 years, what does this suggest for the future? Kind of using continuity and change in the past to help kids think about the future of the relationship between Quebec and Canada. I just thought, I didn't actually do that with my students. We didn't get that far. But I was thinking that would be kind of some really good critical thinking. So I never collected it. I never marked it, so to speak. But the students were able to check their own understanding of the content. And they were also able to check their own understanding of what we mean by continuity and change, because they knew that in the course culminating activity they would have to use those historical thinking concepts. So that's the ESL Canadian history example.
This was one of the last points that Risa and I knew that we wanted to make. Obviously, with the shift towards historical thinking, people are going to be grappling with questions around assessment. And when we were looking at the achievement chart and thinking about the categories, I mean, knowledge and communication still seem fairly self-evident in terms of how they might be assessed. But we think that using a historical thinking approach really does allow a lot of opportunities to assess students' thinking and their application. In terms of thinking, you know, we put up there things like their use of planning skills, so finding appropriate primary sources. Their use of critical and creative thinking processes are going to be there. With application, I think which is really neat, because that tended to be a category where I didn't necessarily have as much to assess as I would have liked. If we're teaching the historical thinking skills in an explicit sort of fashion and helping students to develop criteria by which they can judge different events or like historical significance or whatnot, that allows us, under the transfer of knowledge and skills to new contexts, to begin to assess that as an application, which is a big shift, I think, and one that has certainly changed my assessment a fair bit. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Risa, or not.
I would just say that, like a lot of teachers, I struggle with, well, is it thinking or is it application? And when I look at this chart, sometimes it's easy to tell, and then other times you're not sure. But I think what this does is it gives us the confidence that we are assessing higher order thinking, critical thinking. So I wouldn't get too stressed out about whether it's thinking or application. I would focus more on, are you getting to critical thinking? Because knowledge, as I always say to my students, the knowledge part is just, it's the foundation. It's the who, what, where, when, how. It's the basic information. We've got to move further up the ladder towards the thinking and the application. So I know people get nervous about deciding which category it goes into, but I think it's okay as long as, when you're starting out, as long as you're getting kids to do the critical thinking. So that was kind of what Scott and I were thinking in terms of a short intro to historical thinking, the philosophy behind it, a couple of real-life examples of it. So Allison, I don't know if you've got any questions, but it's kind of the most important part is, what do people want to know and how can we help them along?
Exactly, yeah, I do have some questions, so let me get right started right now. We had the first question we got was, and either of you can answer this, if one of you has a brainwave, just jump in. Do you find that students struggle with the revealing criterion for historical significance? I found that the explanation in the Big Six was too complicated. And that was a question for one of our participants.
I want Scott to answer it, but I want to just kick in, like, I've been doing historical thinking for years, and I struggle with that immensely, so I want to hear what Scott has to say.
Yeah, absolutely they do, and I think that's why, in terms of the continuum of development, the revealing criterion is, the last one that students are going to hit, and not all students are going to get there. And the research is quite clear on that too. Not all students, even by the time they graduate from high school and enter into university, are going to be adept at historical thinking. In terms of getting them there, I do find the more that I can expose students to the idea that history is about narratives, it's about different stories that are of interest to us, helps them to begin to recognize the meaning of the revealing criterion. So if I can talk to them about different narratives within history, it can begin to sort of twig for them that one narrative can be really powerful and important to one particular group of people. And that sort of leads, I think that's the scaffolding to get to that revealing criterion.
Yeah, and I would just say that in terms of significance, I think some teachers see it as the easiest of the historical thinking concepts, and I sort of agree with that, but what I find is that I don't spend a lot of time on significance per se, but when you finish the whole course and the students are really familiar with all the historical thinking concepts, that is a good time to come back and to go back to significance and really look at it in a deeper way and have students recognize that it is a very deep thing. It's not a surface thing.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Sort of on a similar train, but kind of coming at from a different perspective, we've talked about, really going deep into historical significance and discussing with your students how they can become better thinkers in terms of history. But we also have, I've noticed a couple of questions come through with people saying, how can we have rich conversation and discussion about topics if we minimize content? Students won't have the knowledge or context to support their ideas. I'm torn between depth and breadth. Do you have any suggestions? And this is, I'm sure, a common problem.
Yes. Do you want to go first on that one?
Sure. It's a common problem and one that I don't think we're likely to solve, unfortunately. In terms of research, the Brits with the school's history project went for depth and did really in-depth studies of just a few topics and found exactly what you are being talked about there, that students lack the ability to sort of contextualize these things that they're looking at in depth. So I do think there is a need to do overviews. With the grade 10 course, I tend not to do it quite as much just because the content isn't quite as broad. With the world history courses, I usually start off my units with a lecture where I'm contextualizing, the things that we're going to be looking at. So that's usually where I get in the breadth, and then that serves as my sort of jumping off point to look at something in more depth.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say obviously it's a huge problem, and I mean, I'm a contextual freak. I could spend, 80% of the time on context, but then where was the critical thinking? So what I say to myself is let some stuff go. And again, like Scott, I come from the background of teaching the world history courses, which cover a much larger scope than Canadian history. I realize that's somewhat unfair to say because it is our country and we want students to know things in more depth, and I guess what they learn in Canadian history has more direct relevance to their lives. But if we can teach 50,000 years of history in grade 11, then I think we can do it in grade 12 by giving ourselves permission to let go. Also, with having the inquiry approach, the teacher's not always driving the car all the time. The teacher is facilitating the learning of the students. So if you're learning about World War I and you have different groups learning about different battles, they don't all have to share with each other. Not every group has to know what every other group was doing. That is a way to do that. So I just I give myself permission to let go of some stuff, and I say variety is the spice of life, If I'm introducing something, maybe one day or half a period will be context, and then we've got to get into the inquiry, and I kind of have to shut myself up and put things into the hands of the students.
Great, thanks, Risa. And there's actually quite a good discussion about this topic happening on Twitter right now. So if you're following us on Twitter, we're at Ontario History, and the hashtag today is historical thinking. let some stuff go is, I think, a really good way to think about how to manage your topics with students. And one of our OHS staffers actually suggested choose fewer topics and go for depth. It's easier said than done, but he recommends good documentaries as a really good way to help with big picture kind of teaching and just getting a sense of an overall sense of a topic.
Sorry, it just occurred to me, I really don't mean this in a trite way, but read the curriculum expectations without reading the EGs, without reading the examples. And, you know, when we're assessing, we are assessing the overall expectations. So if you read those overalls, they're very broad. And I think people just get very hung up on the EGs in the specific expectations. It's like, oh my, you know, I have to do that and I have to do that. You have to pick and choose.
Well said. We've actually just had an interesting question that sort of segues into a question I had, but this is from one of our participants. I would like to do a better job of getting my students to visit the past, which is a different country. I think this fits in with the perspectives category. What suggestions might you have for this?
Well, I'll just say briefly, for me, the biggest tool in the toolbox that I use for this is in the historical perspectives concept. One of the guideposts from the Historical Thinking Project is for students to recognize the gap between us and them. And I find to visit the past, they must be very upfront and open about the differences between us and the past. That's just, that would be my little intro to that answer.
I would add two things in terms of perspective taking. In my experience, one thing that I found, I mean, students are naturally going to be fairly presentist, and that's something that we need to work very actively and directly against. So, I mean, whenever I run up, whatever it is I first run up against in a course where students are likely to think that, you know, people in the past were, you know, mentally defective or something like that, I confront that very directly and pointedly and talk with the students about, you know, these people were just as intelligent as we were. They were just approaching things in a different way, and the question, you know, isn't why were they doing something that's so strange? So, you know, why at the turn of the century didn't women have the vote or whatever? It's what was going on that supported people to believe that was the right thing to do. And I think once they're sort of pushed in that direction, you can begin to do things. And this sort of ties back to the point we were making earlier. Once you've done that, in order to really engage in perspective taking, that's one of the areas you do really need to go for depth and provide students the opportunity to really sort of sink their teeth into beliefs in a particular time period so that they can understand what was going on and why it was that, you know, men at the turn of the century felt women shouldn't have the vote, or, you know, whatever issue it is that you choose to engage in that way.
I would just say you've got to, obviously you have to scaffold the learning for the students, and one of the things that I like to do at the beginning of a course is teach this idea of presentism and not imposing our beliefs and values on the past. And so I use a yellow P card. So I just take a piece of yellow paper and I put a big P on it, like a yellow card as in a warning that the referee gives a player in soccer. And just when the students are engaging in discussion about whatever, if somebody thinks that some statement that someone in the class made is presentist, up goes the yellow card. And I find that if they can get that kind of inquiry and passion going, then they're more likely to want to visit the past.
Oh, that's an excellent idea. I really like the yellow card, especially around World Cup time. So that question kind of feeds into something that I was curious about. So I mentioned in our preparation for this webinar to Scott and Risa that we have a number of people joining us today from the museum world who are not classroom educators, they're museum educators, or they're working at heritage sites or in some kind of heritage institution. And I'm wondering if you guys can speak at all to how those types of institutions or places figure in the type of history education and using historical thinking concepts we're talking about today. Do you guys make use of historical sites and museums? If not, what can they do better to attract you, or what are they doing really well that you think is a really important thing to include as a teacher?
It's a tough question to answer, just in the sense that museums and heritage sites are so varied and so different in terms of their offerings. When I think of some of the ones that I do tend to frequent, they're doing a wonderful job in terms of outreach. I'm blown away by the rapidity with which the museum and heritage world has already sort of adopted the language of the new curriculum and sort of made those ties very, very explicitly in, their brochures and that sort of stuff. Archives, are just incredible sources for historical thinking. Some of the displays that they've been preparing and digitizing and making available both physically and online for history educators are going to be such a boon over the coming years. So I think that's really important. In terms of what they could do better,
I was at a teacher presentation at the Ryerson Image Center last year at Ryerson University in Toronto, and they had this incredible exhibit. But what I found is that they wanted us. They wanted our input, they wanted our connections, but I don't think they understood the relationship between the overall expectations and the specific expectations, which is obviously it's a somewhat tricky thing. But I think if the museums can recognize that what they're doing is they're providing the EGs in the expectations in order to meet sort of a broader expectation, I think that understanding would sort of make the connection a little easier. And also that museums are localizing history. I did a tiny little bit of work with a museum in Owen Sound. We never actually got to finish the project, but just looking on their website and the amount of historical objects and documents that they had that fit into the curriculum and sort of made it more local and thus relevant to the students was incredible.
Sorry, I would just add to that as well. I do think there's a real opportunity, again, going back to one of our earlier questions, for museums and heritage sites to help us with the perspective-taking piece. Simply because they can't often sort of go into that depth. With a heritage location, it can be very, very authentic and really enable students to, bridge that gap between the present and the past.
Mm-hmm. Actually, Scott and I designed an activity together by visiting the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum, and we wanted to come up with an activity about Greek women. And so we went to the ROM and we literally counted the objects in their collection that had sent some kind of message about women. And then from there we devised an assignment. So you can be very open-ended with how your students use the resources.
Great. Thank you very much, guys. Something that Scott said stuck in my head, history can become more real for students when it becomes local, and I think that's quite important here. The OHS highly recommends that classroom educators make strong connections with their local history societies, museums, archives, and libraries. These organizations and institutions, they really want to hear from you and are willing to actually tailor materials to your classroom needs. So we recommend that all teachers head over to the OHS website because we have an online heritage directory for the whole province where you can find the local historical society, museum, archive. There's over 1,600 contacts there, and it's at our website, www.ontariohistoricalsociety.ca/directory, and you're easily able to find the local history in your area if you want to get in touch with those institutions or those historians, those volunteers who are really passionate about it. Jan also pointed something out. This is Jan Haskins-Winner from OHASSTA, that there is a lot of work being done academically about historical thinking in museums. There's a new book coming out from the History Education Network which apparently addresses this directly. So there is a lot of thinking being done on that topic. Those are all the questions we've received. I'm not sure, and we're just about ready to be finished, which is great. So Risa and Scott, if you have anything to say at the end, now's your chance.
I would just say, I was just speaking to some teacher candidates, people who are about to go out on their first practicums in the school. And the most important thing I think I said to them is, remember, you're not the deliverer of information anymore. You are the facilitator of their learning and their critical thinking, and historical thinking is the absolute best way to do that.
I would just add, and the slide that's up there about questions I think is quite appropriate. Something like this, as wonderful an opportunity as it is, we can only talk so much and in so much depth, and I'm sure that there are lots of questions that people still have or might have in the days to come. don't at all be shy about dropping me a line. I don't know if Risa feels the same way. She probably does.
Yeah, of course.
If you have questions, if you're looking for a resource for a particular topic or something like that, I know we both we love to help. I mean, it's to our advantage to have the history community as strong as it can be. So don't be a stranger.
Wonderful, and we'll make your contact information available in the email that we're going to send out this week, thanking everyone for being here. All right, so as I mentioned, we are going to be sending out an email this week with a bit of post-webinar resources and a PDF and also the slides from today's presentation. We'll also receive a post-webinar survey. It's very helpful to us if you take a few minutes to fill it out and provide some valuable feedback. It helps us create new webinars and also improve what we're doing. And as Scott and Risa said, please reach out to us at any time if you need anything or any kind of guidance or resources. My email is there, alittle@ontariohistoricalsociety.ca, and we're happy to help at any time. Just a bit about our next few webinars that are coming up. The Ontario Historical Society has a great calendar in the fall of webinars. So in October, we're hosting Learning and Teaching Black History in Ontario with the Ontario Black History Society. And this will focus on the Underground Railroad and will be led by Dr. Brian Walls and Miss Brittany Miles of the John Freeman Walls Historic Site and Underground Railroad Museum. And in November, we're hosting Access Beyond the Ramp webinar. This will examine how Ontario's heritage organizations and institutions can plan for and integrate the principles of access and inclusion. And this will be led by John Ray, who's of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. So we have a very different rotating roster of webinars, so please follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. Become a member if you're interested in finding out more about our webinars coming up, because we do try to change the target audience every few times. Just a bit about membership. We encourage you to learn more about the OHS and OHASSTA if you're not already a member. Both organizations offer great support and resources for educators, and your support will help continue to promote the importance of history education in Ontario's classrooms, museums, and heritage spaces. So visit both our websites and get in touch with our membership coordinators. Their names are there, and we'll make sure that this information is sent out to everyone, so you'll have it this week. But we really encourage you guys to become a member and support the institutions that are doing this work. And finally, a big thank you to our speakers today, Risa and Scott. You guys are wonderful. I really enjoyed having you here, and we're so pleased to be able to offer this follow-up to last year's Historical Thinking Concepts webinar. And thank you so much to our partner group, the Ontario History and Social Sciences Teachers Association, especially to Jen Haskins-Winter, who helped us coordinate that. You can see their website there, and make sure you follow them if you're on Twitter @OHASSTA. And like I said, follow us and like us on Facebook for more updates. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care, everybody.